René Girard would draw the distinction between Christianity proper and hyper-Christianity, which seizes upon, and this was Girard's, the point you just made, as far as I understand it, was extremely close to, if not exactly the same point that René Girard was making, which is that hyper-Christianity is actually quite dangerous. There's a notion of egalitarianism in Christianity. The communists take that and take that value and blow it up and lose the sense of proportion, lose the larger context of values.
It becomes a secularized
Yes.
form of religion that has
so Douglas
no
writes in The
constraints.
War of the West, as Christianity has withdrawn, so one new religion in particular has found its way into the cultural mainstream. It is the new religion of anti-racism. With other grand narratives collapse, the religion of anti-racism fills people with purpose and a sense of meaning. To eliminate Christian belief, how to put this? We cannot go back to a pre-Christian world. That at a minimum is, Tom's point is that at a very minimum.
Well,
right?
we can though. We've tried it certainly in Europe with fascism. Fascism was, on one level, deeply, it was fascinated by the future. It was fascinated by tanks and airplanes and shiny new equipment. But it was also deeply backlooking. There was a conscious effort to go back to the pre-Christian world. Yes. So Mussolini is identifying with Augustus, and Hitler, actually, unlike Himmler, Hitler was very much identified with both the classical Greeks and the Romans. He saw them as Aryans.
And Freud made that statement that the Nazis were some kind of harkening back to the folk, the pagan past.
Well,
yes.
Yeah, and by the way, I'd just add one other thing to that, which is a point that David Berlinski's made in a book, that actually, if you look back at the 20th century, what is the one thing that the murderers, gangs of Pol Pot, Hitler and Stalin and every other despot of the 20th century, what's the one thing they all had in common? None of them thought that God was watching.
But Douglas, I would distinguish the Nazis from those inspired by communist ideology.
Yeah.
Communist ideology bears the DNA of Christianity.
That was millenarian.
Yes.
That was
Yeah,
kind of
because it's all
millenarian,
about the last shall be first, the first shall be last.
Yes,
Dives and Lazarus. It's all there.
It's a
The thing about-
secularized form of Christianity that denies that God is watching, and
with
therefore
a
all
deep,
things are
with
lawful.
a deep strain of the apocalyptic, this idea that the world can be born again, that New Jerusalem can be born. The thing about the Nazis is that, unlike the French or the Russian revolutionaries or the Chinese revolution, the French and the Russian revolutionaries who were bred of the matrix of a Christian society, unlike them, the Nazis consciously repudiate not just institutional Christianity, but the fundamental values of Christianity. And they, Paul says there is no Jew or Greek. The idea of a kind of universal human dignity is fundamental to Christian ideology. They reject that.
As to Marx, but not to the Nazis.
Yeah, right. But and also the other core one, of course, that they reject is, I said that the image of the cross symbolizes the idea that the tortured triumphs over the torturer. That is not what the Nazis believe. No. The Nazis believe that the strong should crush down the weak, and they do it for the Nazis do it not because they want to be wicked or evil. They do it because they think that is what is morally justified.
If I could make a couple of points quickly, one thing is noticeable that we've devolved onto the discussion of the Nazis, but there's a reason, which is that we also live still in the shadow of that.
We certainly do.
And Europe, where we're currently sitting, lives under a previous shadow as well. When Pope Benedict visited England, my friend Rabbi Jonathan Sachs gave an address to Pope Benedict in which he said something very important. He said, the peoples of Europe didn't lose faith in God just simply because they lost faith in God. In the idea of the peoples of God being able to get on with each other. Europe, as people know, in the 16th century was a hellish demonstration of the fact that religion brought war, brought turmoil to society. In the 20th century, we have to work out how we have God after this, and we're still working that out. We're nowhere near a conclusion if we could ever get to one. But it's interesting that everything must always be polluted by it, because it's another one of the reasons why the peoples of Europe and the peoples of the Christian world moved away from God.
That's such an interesting observation, Douglas, because in essence he's saying that we've lost faith in God because we've become disillusioned with ourselves. And I think there was an interesting piece in the New York Times a couple summers ago by Ross Douthat, the very thoughtful columnist there, who is also, I think, a Catholic believer. And he was raising the question, and it's the same question I'd like to raise, which is, and given the human failures and the wars of the last century, is it yet still possible to rethink the God question? Because we didn't reject God because of a lack of evidence for the reality of God in creation or in our world. Instead there's an intellectual antecedent. There's the Enlightenment in the 18th and 19th century. There's the 19th century scientific materialism, but then there's also this background of the human nature problem expressed in the religious wars. But if we look at the evidence itself,
historical or scientific?
I mean, scientific evidence.
All right,
and I also think there's been a great shift in philosophy away from, there were these very facile disproofs of the possibility of the miraculous by people like David Hume and the Enlightenment. I think those are, most philosophers regard those as very weak arguments indeed. But I think the scientific evidence, to me, I had a long, myself, tortuous religious conversion. It took about 7 years. It was anything but a Damascus Road experience. I overthought everything, but finally settled. And it was soon after that I began to encounter these scientists at major meetings who were themselves having intellectual conversions to some form of theism and later even to Christianity. Alan Sandage, a notable figure, a great, long-time Jewish agnostic cosmologist whom I heard speak early in my scientific career, and he shocked the audience by explaining how he had come to a belief in God not in spite of the scientific work that he did, but in large part because of it. He was one of the scientists who was documenting the expansion of the universe. And Douthat, in this piece in the New York Times 2 summers ago, said, look, in light of some of these developments, he was talking about, the one he cited was the fine-tuning argument that the physicists are talking about, that the universe not only had a beginning, but it's been finely tuned against all odds and for no underlying physical reason to allow for the possibility of life. And some of these developments intellectually, I think, ought to cause us perhaps to rethink that default materialism or atheism that we all inherited out of the 19th century.
Now we have two modes of thought taking place here, as far as I can tell. You're talking about the evidence, the scientific evidence. I don't know how you respond to that, but I'm a layman. That strikes me as very compelling. That has to be taken into account. That new evidence can no more be unknown or undiscovered than can mode of thought number 2. Just a moment. Remember the trenches in the First World War? Those were Christian nations. That was pre-Nazi. Those were all Christian nations engaging in slaughter of each other on an astonishing, massive scale.
It's a huge question. Where were the statesmen to stop that?
Where was God? Where was God? These are things that also the history cannot be unexperienced or unlived
It wasn't
either.
just the Second World War. I mean, Christian faith for many people died in the Somme. But I think that something has to be observed here, which is what Stephen says, which is that if you're a person of faith, let alone a person of the Christian faith, whenever a new discovery comes up, you will want it to bolster the argument you have. Now, the problem I can say is that many atheists will take the same line, albeit the opposite way, which was that they will hope that it will bolster their case. My own view, of course, remains we just don't know. And it seems to me that Christians will want the answers to be Christianity. Atheists will want it to be atheism. But the mode that our own age should try to be in should be to simply be open to these questions.
I completely agree.
So hold on. I'm going to reassert control and get the first question. Nope. It'll get more interesting.
Excellent.
So to take this, here's what I'd like to know. What I'd like to pursue next is, what do we...
Once again, just a fascinating interplay between these three men, talking about how is it that has shaped the lives of humanity? How is it that has shaped their own personal lives? And where Tom Holland and I would argue Douglas Murray go at it from perhaps the atheistic agnostic side, especially, Douglas Murray talking about that, he just doesn't really know. So he basically is sort of straddling the fence on this and basically putting it out there. He's not sure. He doesn't know. Is there a God? Is there not a God? Faith, no faith. Which is the right religion? What's right? What's wrong? Douglas Bay says no. Holland Stephen Meyer on the other hand, he basically says that he came through it through a long, arduous battle through scientific reasoning, utilizing a lot of the writings, a lot of the lectures that he attended from his peers and colleagues, in which they basically said the same thing, that they came to their religious convictions not in spite of science, but because of science. And my own personal view is the same way. Very religious. I am religious. I do believe there's a God. I do believe there's a hereafter. I do believe there's good and evil. And I also believe that the science, that the world around us is showing us that there is some type of a creator, a single solitary being who is in control of all of this. Now, yes, I take it on faith, but then I also take it on logic. How is it that so many things are being controlled so precisely, mathematically? Just take a look at the human body. Look at our speech. We're looking at each other through our eyes. They can't even make anything close to the human eye. Scientists, our DNA structure, our skeletal tissues, our muscles, our fingers, what we can do with this, what we can do with our brain, what we can do with our ears. Everything is concise, precise. To me, it's just illogical that this just sort of, it's just out there. No control, no one's in control. It's just, an explosion occurred and human beings, poof, here we are. That to me is illogical. And what these men are basically trying to say is going a little deeper. They were saying that what was it that shaped the world? Was it these leaders, whether they were good leaders or bad leaders or evil leaders, despicable despots like Hitler and Che and Stalin and Genghis Khan and all of these despots. But then again, you take a look and you see from the religious side, and some of these other despots were quite religious, and some weren't. But take a look at what religion did. How many wars were fought over religion? How many lives were killed because of religion? Because people decided to speak up and against religious dogma, religious conviction. All of these things were occurring. How many wars have started because of religion? How many conquests began in the name of religion? You had Christian kings, Christian popes, you had Muslim leaders, Muslim sultans. Some were very good. Some were absolutely terrible. Some were wicked. Some were good and very gentle with their people and others were absolute evil despots. So this doesn't matter, folks, whether you're coming from a religious side or a non-religious side, atheist, agnostic. Human beings will be human beings. And unfortunately, the majority are good, moral, decent people. They may be religious, they may not be. But it doesn't take a whole lot to cause a lot of death, a lot of destruction, and a lot of suffering, whether you're religious or you're not religious. Anyways, folks, we appreciate you taking the time to watch. You've been watching the Dr. Nasir Shaikh Show. I'm your host, Dr. Nasir. If you've done so already, we'd love for you to subscribe to the channel, like, share, and follow us. Let us know what you think in the comments below. Take a look at our video links above and below. My final thought is always, when you're right, and when you're left, you're wrong. Until next time, folks, take care and stay safe.